Good morning from the Freedom of Information and Privacy Association. I'm Patrick Farnsworth, and this is your Access and Privacy Online News Summary for Saturday, May 30th. This week, we begin in Ottawa, where a number of major files move forward. The federal government says it will amend parts of its contentious lawful access bill, while civil liberties groups continue warning that Bill C-22 could expand state surveillance without the safeguards Canadians need. At the same time, senators are studying Bill C-25, the federal elections bill, with political party privacy once again under scrutiny, especially in light of the Alberta voter data breach. And in British Columbia, the Bill 9 amendments to the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act have now passed, despite significant opposition and important amendments pushed by MLAs, civil society, and the public. Then we turn to Alberta, where the breach involving the personal information of nearly 3 million voters continues to raise questions about political data, foreign influence, and whether similar risks are being created at the federal level. We also have a packed Ontario spotlight with stories on freedom of information reversals, public protests, flood funding, endangered species records, municipal meeting transparency, domestic violence disclosure laws, and animal research oversight. And internationally, artificial intelligence, platform accountability, commercial location data, and civil liberties all remain at the center of fast-moving public policy debates. Let's dive in. We begin with network updates. The federal government says it will amend parts of Bill C-22, its controversial lawful access legislation. Public Safety Minister Gary Anandasangri said Ottawa will clarify that the bill is not intended to breach encryption. He also said the government will define metadata more clearly and review compensation issues for service providers. The bill has drawn intense criticism from civil liberties groups, law professors, technology companies, and encrypted service providers who say it would open the door to serious privacy infringements. The bill could still require companies to build technical capabilities that weaken privacy or expand state access to communications data by allowing authorities to demand that a telecommunications provider like Bell or Rogers reveal whether it provides service to an individual or a number of interest. Companies like Signal and NordVPN have warned they could pull out of Canada if the bill requires them to compromise privacy. As members of the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, we want to highlight their work submitting a brief to the House Public Safety Committee opposing Bill C-22. ICLMG warns that the bill would supercharge state surveillance, weaken privacy protections, and create broader risks for freedom of expression, association, and equality rights. As well, they say, an expansion of state surveillance also undermines Canada's adherence to international human rights and civil liberties obligations. They also note that their request to appear before committee was not accepted, even as the bill moved quickly through a limited committee process. The concern is not only what Bill C-22 says, it is also how often lawful access returns in Canadian politics as something akin to zombie legislation, rising after defeat in a new iteration, each time framed as necessary for public safety, and each time raising deep questions about necessity, proportionality, oversight, and rights. ICLMG was also before the Senate this month on Bill C-9, the Combating Hate Act. There, they warned that while hate-based violence is real and must be addressed, the bill risks chilling lawful expression and protest. Their evidence focused especially on proposed offenses tied to public display of certain symbols, warning that vague drafting could give police broad discretion in protest settings. Next to Bill C-25, senators on the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee heard from the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, Alberta's Information and Privacy Commissioner, former UK and BC Information Commissioner Elizabeth Denham, and experts including FIPA's VoterPrivacy.ca coalition partners at the Centre for Digital Rights. Privacy Commissioner Philippe Dufresne told senators that the Alberta voter data breach shows why political parties need meaningful privacy rules. He noted that unauthorized use and disclosure of voter information can create serious and concrete risks, including survivors of domestic violence and elected officials. Bill C-25 would add some minor new safeguards, but the commissioner said more is still needed. Consent, limits on collection and use, accuracy obligations, access and correction rights, regulator breach reporting, and formal cooperation between privacy and election oversight bodies. That is the core issue. Political parties handle highly sensitive information. Canadians deserve enforceable standards and independent oversight ensuring that electors' fundamental right to privacy is protected. Be sure to visit voterprivacy.ca to learn more. Once again, voterprivacy.ca to learn more. Shifting to the West Coast, Bill 9 has now passed in British Columbia. FIPA continued to oppose the bill after committee stage, warning that it weakens access rights by expanding public bodies' discretion to determine what counts as a reasonable search time, and by broadening grounds to disregard requests. The bill was amended during the process, and credit is due to the opposition and third party MLAs, journalists, and members of civil society who pressured the government to make changes. Both the BC Conservative and BC Green caucuses pressed hard on transparency, asked detailed questions, and helped push changes, including on issues FIPA had specifically called out. But even with those amendments, FIPA's position remains that Bill 9 does not advance the public's right to know. It does not create a duty to document. It does not extend freedom of information provisions to the administrative functions of the Legislative Assembly. And it does not address deeper record keeping and access system problems identified in earlier legislative reviews. We will have commentaries in the week ahead unpacking all these items, highlighting what happened, what changed, and what the passage of Bill 9 means for access rights in British Columbia. Now to Alberta, where the voter data breach continues to grow in significance. An editorial in the Cochrane Eagle says Albertans deserve the whole truth about what happened after the alleged unlawful release of personal information from the provincial list of electors. That list includes information for almost 3 million Canadians in Alberta, potentially one of the largest and most significant privacy breaches in Alberta history. Elections Alberta, Alberta's Information and Privacy Commissioner, and the RCMP are all investigating the use of the Republican Party of Alberta's copy of the voter list by the Centurion Project. The editorial notes the risks for people who depend on privacy for their safety, including survivors of domestic violence, police officers, judges, and others whose home addresses should not be exposed. Premier Danielle Smith has said the province should wait for investigations before deciding whether legislative changes are needed. But the broader public question is already clear. How did the system fail? Who accessed the information? And what will prevent this from happening again? Residents across Alberta want the truth, even if it means a full public inquiry. The story is also expanding beyond Alberta. CBC reports that telemiracle donors in Saskatchewan may have had information exposed after unauthorized access to systems connected to the Kinsman Foundation. According to an email to a donor obtained by CBC, potentially leaked information includes the donor's name, email address, phone number, residential address, and donation amounts. That incident appears separate from the Alberta voter list matter, but it is another reminder that personal data risks are not abstract. Names, addresses, phone numbers, email addresses, and donation histories can all be used to profile, target, impersonate, or pressure people. And reporting from Yahoo News has placed the Alberta breach in a wider geopolitical context. It says U.S. political operatives helped build surveillance-style organizing technology later adapted for Alberta separatist campaigning. David Parker, the app's architect and former Harper PMO staffer, claims he bought the data on the, quote, black market for $45,000. The reporting describes a model of political pressure built around personal networks, using data to identify people, map relationships, and push targeted persuasion. The United States wasn't the only country shown pushing for Alberta separatism. There were also Russian propaganda sites pushing for it. The origins and legality of the Alberta data use remain under investigation, but the lesson is already urgent. When political organizations receive, collect, or use voter information without modern privacy rules, the public is asked to trust systems that were not designed for today's data environment. That is why FIPA continues to urge people to look not only at Alberta, but also at the federal level. Bill C-25 is before Senate now, and Elizabeth May is championing House of Commons petition E7237, calling for meaningful privacy protections and independent oversight for federal political parties. You can learn more at voterprivacy.ca. Once again, you can learn more at voterprivacy.ca. Now to broader items across Canada, but starting with the spotlight in Ontario. First, the Canadian Press reports that Premier Doug Ford's government has reversed course and will no longer go to court to block release of documents about Ontario's failed blue license plates. The Ford government says the decision was made last week, however, it was not mentioned in response to a request for comment or earlier when asked about the case in question period. The records were sought through a Freedom of Information request by the Canadian Press. The government found 15 records but denied access to them in full, citing an exemption that protects advice of civil servants, as well as an exemption for information that would disclose a pending policy decision. Ontario's Information and Privacy Commissioner had ordered the government to release them, finding there was a compelling public interest in disclosure. The government initially sought judicial review, arguing the commissioner's decision was unreasonable. Now the Premier's office says the government will withdraw the case and comply. That reversal is significant because it comes after Ontario passed broader changes that shield records of the Premier, cabinet ministers, and their staff from public access after the government took the IPC to court over a decision ordering Ford to disclose cell phone records based on an FOI request from Global News and lost. In this case, the public may still learn more about the options, costs, and decision-making behind the blue plate rollout. Meanwhile, in Georgetown, LGI reporter Christian Collington at the IFP.ca reports that a Fight Ford rally is planned for May 30th as part of a province-wide grassroots protest. Organizers say the rallies are focused on issues including Highway 413, weakened endangered species and conservation authority protections, and the changes to Freedom of Information rules. The Georgetown demonstration is one of dozens taking place across Ontario. Residents looking to attend rallies outside of Georgetown can find the full list of locations online. For access and privacy watchers, the story shows how FOI is moving out of specialist circles and into broader public concern about democratic accountability. And in Toronto, LGI reporter Julia Lawrence at the Green Line reports that the city set aside $2 million a year for a flood-prone neighborhood, but residents have received less than 3% of that annual budget so far. The Rockcliffe No-Fault Grant was created to help residents recover from uninsured basement flooding caused by qualifying storm events. Out of 24 submissions, 13 Rockcliffe Smith households received funding since the No-Fault Grant program officially launched in November 2024. The city said applications can be submitted up to 2 years after an eligible storm event, meaning the total number of claims may still increase. Since the program launched, there have been 2 qualifying floods in July and August 2024, but records obtained through Freedom of Information showed just under $60,000 has been distributed. Residents describe sewage flooding, repeated denials, and a lack of accountability. The access issue here is practical. Without records, residents would have little way to compare the program's public promise with its actual delivery. Staying in Ontario, LGI reporter Leah Bortz-Cooperman at the Narwhal reports that internal ministry records show Ontario Natural Resources staff warned about weakened habitat protections, reduced oversight, and enforcement gaps before the province replaced its Endangered Species Act. The new act allows most projects, whether related to housing, mining, or other industries, to begin as soon as proponents register online, in place of an expert review of permit applications. The records, some obtained through Freedom of Information law, show concerns that the new approach could rely too heavily on self-registration by developers. Staff also warned that exemptions from Environmental Bill of Rights posting requirements could reduce public review, transparency, and trust. There were also concerns proponents may also misinterpret or manipulate rules and regulations. Despite those concerns and objections from municipalities and Indigenous groups, the province moved ahead. The story is a strong example of why internal records matter. They show not only what government decided, but what risks officials identified before the decision was made. In South Bruce, LGI reporter Emily Bowen at the Mildmay Town Crier reports that council has again declined to explore recording its public meetings. At a May 12th meeting, council considered several transparency motions, including a proposal to review options and costs for video recording meetings and posting them online. Only one, a change to how closed session materials are distributed, was approved. Staff are allowed to circulate closed session agenda packages to members at least 48 hours before meetings. South Bruce remains one of the few municipalities in the region that does not record council meetings, relying instead on written minutes as the official record. Supporters argued recordings would improve visibility into council operations and improve access for residents who cannot attend in person. Opponents cited cost, staff workload, and the view that existing minutes and media coverage are enough. For local democracy and a modern context, the question is simple but important. Can people meaningfully follow decisions if the only public record is a written summary? And in Kingston, LGI reporter Michelle Dory Forstell at Kingstonist reports that animal justice is challenging Queen's University's position after Ontario passed a ban on invasive medical research involving dogs and cats. The legislation follows months of public pressure and scrutiny surrounding animal testing in Ontario laboratories. The new law prohibits using dogs or cats in invasive medical research or testing, and bans breeding them for that purpose. While the legislation includes exceptions for some veterinary-related research conducted, quote, in accordance with the regulations, end quote, the precise scope of those exemptions has not yet been publicly defined. Animal Justice says the law clearly applies to Queen's University's hemophilia dog colony. The organization's interpretation directly challenges suggestions from Queen's officials earlier this spring that the procedures involved in the university's hemophilia research are non-invasive and comparable to routine veterinary care. Queen says it is still assessing the impact and has not clarified whether it believes the colony falls outside the legislation. This story raises transparency and accountability questions in research oversight. When public institutions conduct controversial research, the public needs clear answers about legal compliance, ethical standards, and what happens to animals already in research programs. Now to other Canadian access stories. And while this first story is not a direct Canadian FOI case, it is a transparency story about trade, enforcement, and how whistleblower systems can expose hidden conduct with major public consequences. The Canadian Press reports that two Canadian steel companies have agreed to pay $19 million to resolve U.S. allegations that they misrepresented the origin of imported steel. The U.S. Justice Department alleged the companies knowingly avoided proper duties on flat-rolled steel manufactured in Europe and Asia. Throughout the period, the Department of Justice alleges the Canadian companies were misleading U.S. Customs and Border Protection about the duties. Steel imports compliant with the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement on Trade were not subject to any tariffs. The case was brought forward through a whistleblower provision in the U.S. False Claims Act that allows private parties to file lawsuits on behalf of the United States for false claims, with the whistleblower broker set to receive about $3.6 million. In Ottawa, the Canadian Press used the Access to Information Act to obtain a memo showing federal officials were concerned about whether Ottawa's transit system could support the Public Service Return to Office plan. The memo was prepared before a February meeting between senior federal officials and Ottawa Mayor Mark Sutcliffe. It noted that unreliable bus service was one of the most common concerns raised by federal employees in the National Capital Region. There was also a meeting about the Return to Office plan that touched on the road network, parking, and availability of office space. The memo said OC Transpo was missing performance targets, with hundreds of daily bus cancellations and ongoing uncertainty around rail capacity. It claimed that failure to meet these targets resulted in hundreds of daily cancellations, particularly during peak hours. Large portions of the memo were redacted. Even so, the released records show how access requests can reveal the operational assumptions behind major workforce decisions. The Canadian press also obtained a Privy Council office memo prepared for Prime Minister Mark Carney after the mass shooting in Tumbler Ridge, British Columbia. The memo warned that public reaction was shifting from grief toward accountability questions, including mental health intervention, firearms access, and whether warning signs were missed. Police had visited the home due to mental health concerns over the years. Guns were seized on at least one occasion and later returned. The memo also advised that confidence in first responders remained intact after the tragedy, quote, but scrutiny of broader systems is likely to increase as investigators progress, end quote. It also warned that online discussion was vulnerable to polarization and misinformation. The details of the violence remain painful, and investigations continue. BC Public Safety Minister Nina Krieger said last Thursday the police investigation was in its final stages, but making information public too soon could compromise the probe. But from an access perspective, the story shows how government tracks public sentiment after major events, and how officials anticipate pressure on institutions, systems, and policy choices. And on Mudge Island, LJ reporter Hope Lompe at the Gabriola Sounder reports that residents remain disappointed their land use bylaw review will wait until after the Gabriola official community plan review is complete. The issue began after dozens of bylaw complaints were filed against properties on the small boat access island. A Freedom of Information request later suggested the complaints may have resulted from a coordinated effort by two people. A special meeting in July 2024 had approximately 72 Mudge Islanders in attendance to discuss these complaints and their existing 2007 land use bylaw. The merit of the complaints stood on. It was decided to put a pause on all bylaw investigations until a review of the Mudge Island land use bylaw could be complete. Residents say outdated bylaws do not reflect the practical realities of a remote island, including access, mooring, and accessory structures. The local trust says staff resources are limited. For the community, the access issue is not only about getting records, it's about whether public processes can respond quickly enough when records reveal a deeper governance problem. Turning to Canadian privacy stories. The Canadian press reports that the federal government is expected to release its National Artificial Intelligence Strategy next week. Prime Minister Mark Carney confirmed the timing on Parliament Hill. The strategy has been delayed as public concern about AI safety, labor impacts, online harms, privacy, and accountability has grown. Artificial Intelligence Minister Evan Solomon initially promised the strategy would be tabled by the end of last year. The government had initially signaled a strong focus on adoption and economic growth, but the public debate has shifted. In August, a Ledger poll found a large majority of respondents said governments should regulate AI tools to ensure their ethical and safe use. In November, most respondents told North Pole Strategies they would prefer the government to be skeptical and do its best to ensure Canadians aren't harmed or deceived by the technology. Recent concerns include AI chatbots, cybersecurity, social media addiction, intellectual property, job displacement, and environmental costs. Meanwhile, Canada has also strengthened relationships with other middle powers that are more pro-regulation than the United States. The strategy is expected to connect with promised federal legislation on private sector privacy and online harms. The central question is whether Canada will treat AI as a mainly economic opportunity, or whether it will build enforceable guardrails around systems that can affect rights, safety, and public trust. Turning to Quebec, LJ reporter Marcus Bancuti at the Eastern Door reports that the province has introduced legislation to allow disclosure of personal information to people who believe an intimate partner or former partner may pose a safety risk. The bill is inspired by Clare's Law models in other jurisdictions. The government has said the system would complement other measures already in place. It would also allow people to consult police about a partner's history of domestic violence or relevant court conditions. The Vice Premier, Minister of Indigenous Affairs and Public Security, and author of the law, Yann Lafrenière, emphasized that a wall-to-wall approach is needed to address intimate partner violence in the province. Quebec Native Women's Group supports the goal but says Indigenous women must be included in the process given the disproportionate violence they face. The organization said it is not too late to ensure Indigenous women are fully incorporated in the process. The minister says consultations are now beginning and Indigenous groups will be included. This is a difficult privacy story because it involves competing public interests. Personal information should be protected, but in urgent safety contexts, carefully governed disclosure can also prevent harm. In Alberta, LJ reporter Nicholas L.M. Allen at the Crow's Nest Pass Herald reports that a court ruling and a privacy investigation have both placed the province's separation petition under renewed scrutiny. The Alberta Court of King's Bench squashed Elections Alberta's approval of the separatist petition after finding that First Nations had not been consulted. Piikani Nation Chief Troy Knowlton called the decision a historic victory for treaty peoples. Premier Danielle Smith has said the province intends to appeal the court ruling, according to reporting from The Guardian, which quoted her calling the decision, quote, incorrect in law and anti-democratic, end quote. At the same time, Alberta's Information and Privacy Commissioner continues to investigate the alleged breach involving the provincial list of electors. Commissioner Diane McLeod has said the breach is serious and that Alberta's privacy laws still do not apply to political parties, highlighting a gap in the laws. The two issues are legally distinct, but together they show how constitutional rights, electoral processes, and personal information protection can collide in moments of political instability. And in the Northwest Territories, LJ reporter Cody Farron at Yellowknifer reports that as many as 1,700 people may have been affected by a cybersecurity incident involving the Canvas learning management platform. The GNWT says potentially affected people include education staff, government employees, contractors, and program participants. Affected government departments include education, culture, and employment, infrastructure and industry, tourism, and investment. Compromised information may include names, email addresses, and training or enrollment information. The government says passwords, financial information, and sensitive information were not accessed because the Canvas platform does not store financial or sensitive information. The Information and Privacy Commissioner of the Northwest Territories has been notified. It is a smaller breach than Alberta's, but the lesson is familiar. Public bodies and service providers need strong safeguards, clear notification, and plain language updates when systems holding personal information are compromised. Now to international stories. In the United States, the Associated Press reports that the Department of Health and Human Services is expanding its use of artificial intelligence to detect possible fraud in federally funded health programs and to police how states and other recipients of federal health dollars are auditing their programs. The department says it will use ChatGPT and other AI tools to analyze audit reports from all 50 states on an ongoing basis. The move builds on the department's embrace of generative AI for investigating state Medicaid programs, automating administrative tasks, and editing text. Officials say the goal is to identify unresolved deficiencies and protect public funds. But critics warn that government AI systems can make mistakes, reflect bias, or be used unevenly, especially when fraud enforcement becomes politically charged. This is one of the core public sector AI questions. Pattern detection may improve oversight, but automated review still needs transparency, human accountability, and meaningful safeguards against error. In California, the Associated Press reports that San Francisco has launched an AI-powered whale detection network to reduce collisions between ships and whales. The system, called Whale Spotter, uses thermal cameras and AI to detect whale blows and heat signatures in the bay, then alerts mariners so they can slow down or reroute. Researchers say the system's biggest advantage is constant monitoring. Unlike human observers, thermal cameras can operate through the night and in many foggy conditions common in the bay. The technology is being introduced after a rise in gray whale deaths in the Bay Area. Last year, 21 dead gray whales were found in the wider Bay Area, with scientists saying those figures likely underestimate the true toll, as many whale carcasses sink or are swept back to the sea before they are ever found or reported. This is a more constructive example of AI deployment, a focused system aimed at a concrete public interest problem, with human verification before alerts are sent. but it also shows how environmental monitoring is increasingly becoming data infrastructure. In Brazil, President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva has signed decrees increasing pressure on major technology platforms to respond to illegal user content and paves the way for investigations by a government body into their responses to such cases. Brazil's government said in a statement that from now on, platforms must analyze any complaints and if the content is deemed criminal, remove it immediately while communicating the decision to the person responsible. The measures align government regulations with a Supreme Court ruling making platforms liable when they refuse to remove content after judicial orders. They also enable Brazil's Data Protection Authority to investigate some cases. The move also expands the current law's capacity to address the growth of digital fraud, online scams, and new forms of online violence. Supporters say platforms should not profit from illegal content or avoid responsibility for harms online and could threaten free speech. Critics warn that vague obligations could lead companies to over-remove lawful expression. Brazil's approach increasingly resembles the European model: stronger public oversight of platform power, but ongoing tension between safety, privacy, accountability, and free speech. In Washington, the Associated Press reports that U.S. lawmakers are warning of gaps in rules meant to prevent foreign adversaries from buying commercial location data tied to sensitive government sites. Such data can reveal sensitive information that can be exploited for espionage purposes. The rules were designed to restrict access to location data from places that could reveal the movements of officials or personnel. But congressional Democrats say key sites, including the White House, Congress, and CIA headquarters, were left off the protected list. The concern is straightforward. Commercial availability location data can reveal patterns of life. In anyone's hands with proper analysis, it could become an intelligence tool. In a letter, the Trump administration was urged to address the oversights and create a protection zone that encompasses the entire Washington, D.C. region rather than choosing individual buildings. The letter also urged the department to expand the list of countries of concern that were barred from acquiring data on Americans. And finally, the Associated Press reports that the Southern Poverty Law Center is seeking dismissal of a Justice Department indictment, arguing the case is a vindictive prosecution driven by political retaliation. The Alabama-based nonprofit was indicted in April on fraud and money laundering charges that accuse it of misleading donors by paying informants inside white supremacist and other extremist organizations to obtain inside information about their activities. Lawyers for the SPLC have already argued that law enforcement agencies have long known that the nonprofit paid informants to report on the movements of hate groups. The SPLC says its past work monitoring extremist groups is protected activity, and that the prosecution reflects a broader campaign against perceived opponents of the administration. The Justice Department's case involves allegations of fraud and money laundering tied to the organization's use of informants. The department decided to pursue the indictment without having interviewed any current SPLC employees, and did not seek any documents from the group until after it had told defense lawyers that criminal charges were forthcoming, defense lawyers say. The motion also cites whistleblower accounts that accuse top Justice Department officials of rushing forward with an indictment despite internal concerns about the merits of the case and the strength of the evidence. The court will decide the legal merits, but the broader civil liberties issue is clear. When enforcement power is used against advocacy organizations, transparency, independence, and procedural fairness become essential to public trust. Before we go, one final story from Thunder Bay. LGI reporter Carrie Ivardi at tbnewswatch.com reports that age-friendly Thunder Bay and the Thunder Bay District Health Unit have relaunched ERIC, the Emergency Response Information Kit. A similar system was in place 10 years ago but was removed for being overly complicated and has since been streamlined. The kits include a brochure which can be placed on a fridge or on the back of a front door, where emergency responders can easily find it. It contains essential medical and personal information to assist paramedics or police when they enter a home. The kit lets residents keep essential medical and personal information in a simple, visible place for paramedics, police, or firefighters. There is also a portion of the information kit where all the providers who are currently in the home can add their information. A red sticker near the entrance signals that the kit is available inside the home. It is a useful reminder that privacy is not only about withholding information, it is about control, context, and purpose. There are moments when sharing the right personal information with the right people at the right time can protect health and safety. A well-designed tool can make that possible without turning personal information into a general-purpose data source. That is it for this week's Access and Privacy Online News Summary. As always, we hope today's stories help you stay informed about the latest issues in privacy, information management, and public transparency. To help us keep the mics on, please subscribe through FIPA News Monitoring, share the podcast, or consider making a donation. And don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe wherever you listen. Our writer is Sean Fisk. Original music in today's show was composed by the mysterious Breakmaster Cylinder. I'm Patrick Farnsworth, your host and producer. Thank you for joining. A big FIPA thank you to all the contributors, reporters, and outlets that make this podcast possible, and to you, our listeners, for staying engaged. Stay safe and stay informed.